Hi there.
How are you doing today?
Really good. I'm glad we got you. We were panicking there for a bit.
Hey, I got to tell you, they always say that a photograph is worth 1,000 words. But I'll tell you what, when you step into Charlie's Good tonight, your words are a rock opera in my heart. I mean, I can hear the music. I can see pictures. I can. It's you. You just have designed something here that is beyond us in this generation.
Oh, well, how can I possibly answer that? That's just, you're much too kind. I'm embarrassed and Charlie would be too.
Well, the last time I saw the Stones in concert here in Charlotte, I mean, I got to tell you, I mean, I know Mick does his thing up front, but I found myself watching Charlie more than anybody else because
Yeah.
there was a rhythm about him. There was always something very mystical and magical about him.
Yes, there was. I'm exactly the same, including in more recent years. And, obviously we had the treat of those amazingly high definition screens that allow you to watch each one individually if you want to, pretty much, as well as watching the collective action. Um, Talk about less is more. He just
Yeah.
had that restrained style about it, didn't he? And really a deceptive amount of power. For somebody quite a short man. Not a big guy in any way, but boy, the power that he could still generate, even on those late tours. And yes, they did begin to take it out of him a bit more towards the last couple, but Mick said this to me in there's a name drop for you. When on one of these recent interviews that I did for the book, that he probably Charlie, in Mick's opinion, had to expend more energy than any of them on stage because Mick, it's his decision whether or not he wants to leap up and down and run from one end of the stage to the other. He doesn't have to. It's entirely his call as to whether he does that. Charlie didn't have that choice. He was there, at the back, timekeeping, the keeping the beat the whole time for probably 2.25 hours or something, um, with barely looking like he'd even broken sweat most of the time. So
That's so
it's
true. That is
something,
so
yeah.
true. Well, I always thought of him as being the true magnetic connection because without him on those drums, I mean, everything,
Mm.
they would have played together, but he kept them together.
Yeah, he totally did, and he always sort of talked this down. You really couldn't pay him a compliment in any way. He'd deflect it. He would deny it sometimes, and he often said to me that he just, he regretted that he never had lessons. That he was obviously self-taught, and he in his eyes lacked discipline in a certain way. But of course, that's the exact opposite of the way that the rest of us saw it. And that great intangible thing that he brought to the Stones because of his love of jazz and that early upbringing in
Mhm.
that swing that he brought, which is so different to say the playing, not to decry it in any way, but make the comparison with John Bonham or Keith Moon. And they're obviously very different players, much as he admired them and was friends with those guys, but it's a very, very different feel to the way they play.
Inside the book, Charlie's Good Tonight, you really put us in a place of Charlie's history that I didn't ever associate Charlie with World War II, but that really kind of shaped his heart as well, that experience.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're all, as like so many musicians that we're still looking up to and playing and revering now, they're all war babies, And Charlie didn't remember, he was born in 1941. He said that he didn't remember very much about the war, and his childhood, although it was quite poor, was very happy. But there was a tangible evidence of the war there because they grew up in what we call the prefabs, which were the houses that were supplied by the government for people who had suffered bomb damage
Yep.
in the war. So it's a very specific thing that happened to them. But small as these places were, it was they were lovely. He grew up in a very loving family environment. And was still there even when the Stones were beginning to play together. And there was some, the guys came around in the famous van driven by Stu, Ian Stewart, the road manager, to rehearse in this tiny little place. A place so small, by the way, that as one contributor told me, Charlie's father was a huge fan of snooker and bought a half-size table at one point, and the place was so small that to take a shot you had to open the window.
I, I got to tell you how important this book is right now. Charlie's Good Tonight, and there's so much marketing going on where it seems like every sweatshirt or T-shirt has Rolling Stones on them, and then you ask the younger
Mm.
generation, "Do you even know who the Stones are?" No, I don't. No, I don't. Now I can point to
Yeah.
this book. I say, I'll say you need to read Charlie's Good Tonight. You need to really find out what it was really like to be on that road and to be a part of the world's greatest band ever.
Yeah, well, that's very kind of you to say so, and I think you're right. Actually, the more, and this is no one's fault really, although it is an example of global marketing, at its height, I suppose. That logo, that genius logo, drawn by John Pesh all those years ago, which Charlie was so proud of, as coming from his graphic design background, you can imagine he thought it was just the greatest shorthand symbol ever, really, and it was, and still is, isn't it? And you see it every day. You'll see usually somebody quite young kind of walking down the street in London. They've got a shop now. They've actually got the Rolling Stones RS number 9 Carnaby shop in Carnaby Street in Soho, which, by the way, and I have to put the plug in, they are actually selling the book in that shop. So that's kind of fun.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's great to see. But yeah, I think you're right that it's a proof of how long they've been going, isn't it? I mean, obviously this has been the year of the 60th anniversary celebrations, but you do have the feeling that there are people who are now sort of more aware of it as a brand than a band, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. As a journalist, don't you feel like a time capsule with all the experiences that you've had with the Stones and writing the stories and things like this, and now the new book? I mean, it's almost like you're saying, I have been carrying this a long time. Here, I'm going to plant this inside your imagination and heart.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Actually, I hadn't thought about it quite in that way, but it is a long time, and obviously I've been around as a journalist for a while, even before I first met any of the Stones. A good friend of mine, a fellow journalist, said the other day that something to the effect, "This is the book I was born to write," or something, which sounds a bit high and mighty, but I suppose it has been there. The elements of it have been sort of bubbling away for quite a long time. And I've always known how lucky I've been to have this sort of access to this band, not on a friendship level, that's not how it works, but just to be asked back each time, to have so many opportunities, every time they put a record out or starting a tour or whatever. And to hang out, spend a bit of time in their company, and you just never want that to end, really. It's so enjoyable to be
You,
in
you
their orbit.
You bring up a very interesting point about being a journalist, because you're right. You can't go into these conversations thinking you've got a friendship built up with these guys. What it is, it's a collaboration. I mean, you are really moving their story into an area where it might be new fans, it might be new listeners,
Yeah.
and things like that.
I think so, yes. And actually, it's interesting to see the reaction. I mean, there's been, some really lovely reviews of the book, and I certainly don't expect them all to be super positive. People are totally entitled to their own opinion. There's one or two people who I think are surprised at my level of enthusiasm for the later Stones records, because there are those who kind of, much as they may still admire them as a live spectacle, that haven't really taken them seriously as a recording act for quite a long time. I mean, some people say that the last great album was Some Girls. Well, that's 40, whatever it is. It's a very, late 1970s. I happen to think that the records they've made in much later times are very good. They're not Exile on Main Street, but I would defend A Bigger Bang or any of the other albums to the hilt. So yeah, there is an element of that, like sort of passing it on, I suppose, just moving the story forward and trying not to just lock it in time. Yes,
Hmm.
we know that they had that classic period, but and I agree with that. Is those albums in that 68 to 72 period are astounding, but the story doesn't begin and end in that time. There's so much more to it, and I think that is something that happens as time goes by, and you have fewer and fewer eyewitnesses to rock history. It becomes a bit like received wisdom, doesn't it? And just stuff that gets handed down, and you see that in documentaries sometimes. It's just the same kind of set moments in a band's story,
Hmm.
and there's more to it than that. And in Charlie's case, I think the idea really, my hope was to try and paint the picture of the man as well as the musician.
I've been with Glenn Johns several times. I mean, to be in that studio with Glenn as well as Charlie, because you got to lay down the drum tracks first. I mean, to be
Mm.
in that moment, oh my God! I mean,
Hmm.
to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the moment that Charlie loved. In fact, it's almost the only moment that Charlie loved, because he's such an unusual character. He would often say to me that he did, he never listened to the Stones records. He was just not.
What?
Um, No, he was not a fan in that way. His wife was. Shirley would play them at home and so on, and he said, "This is amazing." He said to me, "Sometimes I hear him at a party, and I think they sound a bit weak." You think, what? What are you talking about? But he would really not listen to them out of choice at all, unless he had to approve something for a reissue or some mix or something like that. He would much rather be playing a Charlie Parker record. And of course, when you had a conversation with him about jazz, it's like talking to a different person
Yeah.
because he's just like it's so illuminated on that subject.
What was it about Charlie thinking that the Stones would only last about a year? I mean, I giggled like a child when I read that in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's that unusual. There are many interviews with artists around that time. I think even probably some of the early Beatles interviews. Um, it's very hard to imagine this now, isn't it? 60 years later, because it's become so much of just the air that we breathe. But obviously there was no structure, there's no infrastructure for what we now call rock and roll. Of course, it wasn't even rock and roll in those days. We're
Yeah.
talking about the sort of early R&B scene moving into pop. They became a pop band before anything else in their early success. So yes, it was his natural skepticism about everything, plus the prevailing feeling, I think, that this was not a proper job, and that's why it took him a while to make that leap, because they didn't make any money for quite a long time,
Right.
and they weren't really well off until so much later on in their story. And we know, there's every band of that period has a horror story about getting ripped off by somebody or another, and it certainly happened to the Stones. And when they finally did have to, go into exile in France for that famous period, their financial affairs were in absolute tatters. They were in a terrible state. So it was all forced upon them. So yeah, it's we look back and think, how could that ever have been the case? But it certainly was, not a secure way of making a living at all.
Yeah, because I love the way that you do that. You showcase the music business, and so many people only want to see the home runs and the hits and things like that. Whereas you're really giving us the real story in Charlie's Good tonight.
Yeah, I think it's important to do that, and I'm lucky in the sense that this is a band who, well, there is so much detail you can go into, and it's so well documented. It's that was fun, kind of adding new research to what I already knew, and Bill Wyman, I must say in particular, was invaluable with that, both in terms of our new conversation and previous ones we've had, but also in his role, his continuing role really as the band's archivist, you'd have to say. There's a book that Bill brought out some years ago called Rolling with the Stones, which
Yeah.
it's a kind of a coffee table format, a big format, you might know it, and it's fantastic. It's a great read, but it's an amazing reference book as well. It's got every, pretty much a photograph of every ticket they ever sold, and every poster, every tour schedule. It's quite a remarkable thing. So yeah, that was fun to just dive down into that, and dig out some of the funny things that happen, and there's a strong sense of the absurd, I think, with a lot of that stuff. Some of the ways that they would have to dodge the fans, for example. And Charlie saying, I used to hide in doorways, get away from it. And there's this key story about them going up on the rooftop, of a gig after when the place got stormed by fans. The only way to escape them was to go up on the roof, and then they would go. The local mayor or something doesn't actually know how to get them down. It's hilarious.
All right, personal question, because we both love collecting history and the sights and sounds of music history and stuff like that. There comes a point, and I think I'm facing that right now. What are we going to do with all this stuff? You know what I mean? I mean, it's in boxes. It's on hard drives. It's like, what are we doing with it? What are you doing with yours, Paul?
Well, it's a really good question. I'm thinking about it more and more as time goes by, and actually, dare I say, we've had this in the family this year as well. But right at the same time I was writing the book, my elderly mother passed away, and we've been clearing her house, and that includes we're going back decades, but there's things of mine that were still there, in addition to just endless boxes of stuff.
Yep.
And you have to be respectful to it, and there's the clock is ticking in terms of getting it out to start with. But yeah, I'm looking at what living in a house that was already completely overloaded with all of my things, and 40 plus years of memorabilia, and just the recordings of interviews and thousands of records and stuff. and now we've had this addition of all this other stuff from the family as well. And I'll have to get back to you. I don't quite know actually what's
Yeah.
where it's all going to go. I'm more aware of it than ever, I must say.
Now, radio has been one of those things where, I mean, the old days of classic rock, the jocks on the air would share the story of the musicians and stuff like that. We don't get that little tease anymore, and that's why a book like Charlie's Good Tonight is so valuable to the music fan. Because just the other day, someone was telling me their kid just discovered the Rolling Stones, and it's like, you've got to be kidding me. But radio's not talking about it. That's why you are so important right now.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. And there is that tendency. It certainly happens on the radio and other media over here. The temptation always to focus on the obvious, and to just play the big hits and nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an awful lot of people who want more than that now. There's a bit of a backlash against that that sort of way of, whether you call it sort of gold radio format or whatever. But even in the case of something like the Stones, there is that temptation that because there are certain touchstone moments that you feel, everyone seems to feel that you must cover those. And I made it clear from the beginning in conversations with the publisher about the book that the one thing it was not going to be was yet another story of the Rolling Stones, because we don't need it. We don't need that. For all that, I agree with what you say about spreading the word and so on, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books like that. So the idea was, it's partly a Stones story as it relates to Charlie. But it certainly isn't just Charlie in the Stones.
Yep.
Was never the intention. I wanted it to be about his whole life, from the day he was born until the day he died. And that's the finding out some of that personal stuff was just a great pleasure.
Sadly, we're part of that generation now. There are people that you bring up Michael Jordan's name, they go, who? And I think that you and I are going to have to sit down and talk with people and say, no, this is the way Charlie did it. This is how he played. And we are that generation now.
Yes, I think we are. There's a degree of sort of passing it on, isn't there, to people? And I'm so aware, also, in being privileged to do what I do, that I've been able to, sounds a little bit strange to say, but catch people while they're still with us, and while before they go, kind of thing. Because that's not to say these stories will not get retold. They will, of course, in later years. But once the original, once the eyewitnesses aren't there anymore, I think there is definitely that danger of the story getting diluted or mistold in the future, and that you do see that happening sometimes. And once in a while, you think, no, actually, that's not like that. I was there. It's just it's a different thing.
You got to come back to this show anytime in the future, Paul. The door is always going to be open for you, sir.
Well, it's a great pleasure to talk to you, Aaron. Thank you so much.
You be brilliant today, okay?
Yeah, thank you. It's lovely to talk. Thank you for all your kind words.